Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. This week, esteemed journalist from The Times, Tom Whipple, joins me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to share the secrets behind effective science communication. So today we have with us science writer at The Times, contributor to The Economist, maths and physics scholar, author, and apparently a bad loser. Tom Whipple, thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder if we talk about your work and various other things, if we can go back a bit to before your scholarly days, and we can talk about what you might remember from your earliest school days.
In my school days, I went to a grammar school and I did lots of maths. It was one of these schools that seems to just churn out mathematicians, and that was very, very good. And so I started doing maths there, and I kept on doing maths, and I very much enjoyed it. And I went to university and did maths. And slowly realised that maybe I wasn't going to change the world with my calculus abilities. Whilst I was at school, I also started a school newspaper called the Reading Rag. It was Reading School, so I'm giving it away. I don't think they'd mind being called a maths obsessed school. That's absolutely the way they roll. And it was essentially a scurrilous tabloid newspaper. We had my favourite ever edition, which was pulped in its entirety by the head of sixth form, had the front page "School in Sleazy Sex Scandal," which I was particularly proud of. And it almost was. It was about a teacher who'd gone to another school and then got prosecuted for I think trying to sleep with a boy. But anyway, it was justified. From what I now know about media law, it was absolutely justifiably held by the head of sixth form on legal grounds alone. But then when I went to university and did maths as well, just to stay sane, I did journalism too. I wrote for my student newspaper, and my big scoops were the full range. I interviewed Ian Paisley, the Reverend Ian Paisley. I went to his church in Northern Ireland and managed to collar him and get an interview. And I also interviewed someone who's many of your listeners might remember, a guy called the Naked Rambler. He rambled from Land's End to John O'Croats with no clothes on, getting regularly arrested. In fact, he made a large bulk of his income from the fact that you get given, I think, 50 quid when you leave prison. And I went down to his caravan on the south coast and spent a night with him. And then we went rambling naked together. And in fact, that was the thing I think where I thought maybe journalism rather than maths, because there was just this moment the night before where he was cooking for me, and he went to the oven and got out the dessert, and he turned around and he said, "Spotted dick," and I thought, this is going to write itself. That was, I guess, my twin strands are, I've always had science, and I think I've probably always throughout had a little bit of writing, and now I've oddly found a way to combine the two.
That's I mean, it's quite unusual going on a stakeout with the Naked Rambler. So did you spend any time in the lab at all in either setting? Do you remember?
At school, at school we had labs. I was quite good at the theoretical stuff. I was quite bad at the lab work. What you realise when you get in a lab is, I'm just literally talking about school labs, is that things that are meant to work often don't work. I remember in particular the young slits experiment, which is meant to prove wave particle duality or demonstrate wave particle duality. And I'm sure it does, but my God, mine definitely did not. So then at university, I did maths and I did theoretical physics and I did a bit of computer science, all of which keeps you extremely far away from the laboratories. I do remember one of my friends at the time managed to burn down his entire lab, which is it's still not something we can actually talk to him about because he still doesn't find it particularly funny. He's now a very successful academic. He didn't let sort of destroying £1 million lab put him off continuing in academia.
No, good for him. It's all a learning curve. So I wish you could tell me who it was though.
I can't.
Um, so presumably, I mean, you might have done. Did you go straight to the Times from university?
I didn't know. Journalism's a very strange job to get into. I left university and decided I would freelance, which is a posh way of saying I was unemployed, sitting in my parents' house in my pants, trying to come up with ideas. And my interest wasn't initially in writing about science at all. It was just about writing in general. And so I wrote a couple of things for The Guardian. They were I mean, one of them involved following Peter Andre around the clubs of Norwich. They weren't necessarily so. This wasn't Pulitzer stuff. Um,
An
and that,
anthropological study.
yeah, yeah. I guess yeah, there is an element of anthropology to that. And then I went to work on an English language newspaper in Sri Lanka, which was essentially a glorified gap year job. I went out there and I got loads of experience, and it was really interesting. It was just after this. It was the year after the tsunami, and the year before the civil war really began to come to an end. And whilst I was there, I did a tour of the north, and I managed to get arrested by the Tamil Tigers, which is
Oh,
a really useful thing to happen if you're in journalism, because they're one of those old school terrorist organisations who don't behead journalists. It's all perfectly pleasant, and you get a very nice story out of it at the end. And then when I came back, I managed to get a job on the Times foreign desk doing fact boxes and graphics, which are just the little things that go alongside articles. And I sort of clung on. Eventually, I got a reputation as being the person who could use Microsoft Excel, and that was within journalism. Journalism has a lot of humanities graduates, and I was, I guess, the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind. And so when the job of science editor eventually came up, or rather when the other science editor left, I was there and ready to go. Ready to. It wasn't. My route there was slightly more circuitous than that. I think my naked rambling was a large introduction to journalism, and one of the big things I had going for me as a young journalist was a willingness to not have any dignity. And so I did lots of things. I tried out. There was a period when portmanteau words involving men were big. So there was mantyhose, there were men engagement rings, there was mascara, and I tried all of these on for the paper. And I tried fart-proof pants, which had a carbon filter in the seat. And then eventually, I almost sort of got taken seriously and got given the job as science editor.
oh, good. And I think, can I see Guy Liner on today? No?
Guyliner, I did try. I forgot about Guyliner. You will find a byline of me trying out Guyliner, and there is somewhere on the internet a picture of me during COVID when I became a figure of hatred in some groups. There were a bunch of people who think the vaccines are killing us all who pulled up the many embarrassing photos of me and would occasionally taunt me with them, but I'm not embarrassed by them. You've got to start
All right.
somewhere.
Absolutely. Um, and then that must have been quite a pretty big thing when the pandemic descended and you were the science correspondent. Wow, what a responsibility. How did
Yeah,
you feel?
it was. I mean, it was a big learning curve for all of us. I mean, for everyone. I remember, as a journalist, you oscillate between extreme skepticism and, I guess, probably credulity, because you don't know about all of these subjects, and so you think, are we overhyping this? Are we not overhyping this? I remember going to my first press conference on COVID, and it was in mid-January 2020. And I'd looked up the number of people who died of flu in the UK the week before. And I asked this question I thought was very clever, which was, why are we worried about this disease on the other side of the world when these many people die of flu every week in Britain? And I sort of saw this sigh, and one of the journalists one of the scientists, I think, not for the first time over the pandemic, tried to answer the question of why COVID was more worrying than flu. And his name was Neil Ferguson, and that was my first meeting with the great Neil Ferguson. I do remember it wasn't. it wasn't completely the most embarrassing journalist was me. There was the guy from the Sun who, perfectly reasonably, he said, "Well, we're never getting this in the paper unless we get a good name for it." And there'd been a really dodgy preprint out that week, which suggests it might have spread to humans from bats via snakes, which is just madness, like to go into a reptile and into humans. But anyway, he said, we've got to get them to call it snake flu. And there was a period of about 6 weeks. You can see it, it's there in the historical archive where the Sun called COVID snake flu. And then fabulously, at the beginning of March, I think, or maybe the end of February, they wrote an article which said scientists say they will no longer call it snake flu, and like there was only ever one organization in the world that called it snake flu, and it was the Sun. But you know, good on him. He got it in the paper, and he got snakes on the front of the Sun the next day.
Absolutely, and we're still talking about it now. So you were pretty busy reporting on COVID, but at the same time, am I right that you wrote a book?
Yeah,
During the
I'd already
pandemic?
got. Yes, I was writing about. So it was the radio war in the Second World War. I got interested in it for a few reasons. So I should say I'm sort of the last and least distinguished in a long line of mathematicians, and my grandfather and grandmother were both mathematicians, and they met working on radio navigation systems during the Second World War.
Oh.
And so it was this nice link. I actually don't know. I know almost nothing about what they did, and probably what I do know isn't true. It's these sort of family mythologies. We have these anecdotes about him falling in the sea on D-Day and her almost ending up going over to the beaches because she got stuck on a boat while she was describing to them how to use the new fancy navigation systems. I don't know if any of it's true, but I found plenty in the National Archives that was true. And yeah, it was a bit of light relief, I suppose, which is a weird way of talking about probably the only crisis in the past 70 years that was more significant than COVID. But it was a bit of light relief whilst I was covering COVID. I didn't have a lot of time for it, but yes, I got the book finished, and that was out last year.
Mm-hmm. And that's called Battle of the Beams.
Yes,
And
yes.
those beams they're the radio waves, are they?
They're the Germans.
Radar.
Yeah, well, at the beginning of the Second World War, Britain believed that it alone had developed radar and that it was its super weapon. Actually, everyone had it, but we also believed that our bombers could navigate by the stars with sextants, like sort of ships, and so and we believed that because we were a proud seafaring nation, would be better at it than everyone else. It turned out, come 1943, when they did a proper study on it, that almost all of our bombs were completely missed. The Germans had a system from the beginning of narrow radio beams which crossed over the target, and they'd fly down one beam and wait for the crossing point and drop their bombs. And it was a blind bombing system. It was the world's first precision guidance system. And they were using that from the beginning. And so those are the beams, and it became the Battle of the Beams. It was about particularly one brilliant scientist called Reginald Jones, who made it his mission to divert and disrupt these beams and discover these beams. And so there was a period when it was very much very clever people on very clever men and women, such as my grandmother, on both sides of the channel, who were fighting for airwave supremacy at the same time as we were fighting for air supremacy.
Wow. Yeah, it's quite fascinating when you think about the different layers involved. And I don't know, you so much time goes past and you think you can't possibly learn anything more about the war. And then what do you know? A whole nother battlefield crops up.
Yeah, there were a lot of stories. It was a time when a lot of things happened, and it's interesting. You know, if you look at the paper obituary sections, they're now less interesting because we don't have those characters. And I did actually, I thought about it a lot during COVID because there were parallels in that I was writing about the chief scientific advisors effectively to the government in the Second World War, and during COVID I was writing about them. And they were both, mass fatality events. But the thing about COVID was it was boring. It was, in that sense, it wasn't tales of daring do. There was terrorism, there were great scientific stories, but fundamentally for most of us, whereas in the Second World War that would be the period of great drama in their lives, for most of us this was the period of sourdough starters and clapping every Thursday. And I don't think there'll be great tales told of COVID in years to come. And I certainly won't be telling them. I don't want to ever write about it again.
Lab Matters is brought to you by the award-winning temperature control equipment from Polyscience, available worldwide. Polyscience, changing the world of temperature control forever. Well, fingers crossed you don't have to. Let's move on to some other stories. What, if any, have you written about lately that you reckon are going to be current landscape shifters, groundbreaking discoveries?
The things that I'm really, it's interesting. My background is physics, maths. The things I've got really into and really interested in, and the places where we're clearly making massive advances are biotech. It's CRISPR gene editing, it's the mRNA vaccines, and what they're going to do for cancer vaccines, and it's again another. If we want to make Second World War analogies, in the Second World War, it turbocharged rockets, computers, nuclear power, and we came out of it probably 10, 15 years ahead. And exactly the same things happened to mRNA and to genomics. It was astonishing what places like the Sanger lab were doing during COVID, and the level of mass genomic screening. We've never followed the evolution of a virus in real time before. And genomics is going nowhere. And I think we're going to have some really interesting genomic surveillance, but also, of course, the genomics of human beings and the cost that's coming down there and the exciting things that are happening. Things like Our Future Health, which is going to be the biggest study in the world. They're up to 1 million participants, over 1 million participants in Britain, who are getting everything, all their omics done, proteomics, genomics, blood, all of these things, to see if we can spot the signs of disease earlier. And it might fail. We might discover that actually mass screening doesn't really help, but it's a really big, bold idea. And I think there was a real invigoration during COVID of these sectors.
Yeah. I find it really a sort of a modern paradox that we strive so much to prolong life and prevent disease, and yet the main problem with the environmental health of the planet is that there are too many people everywhere, and how we're just going to last longer.
Yeah, we are. Well, the real focus now is not health or life expectancy, but health expectancy. Because one of the depressing things that happen is we have got really quite good at living longer, but we're living longer more unhealthily, and that the period in which we're actually sort of in the prime of our lives isn't extending by anything like the same amount. So the real hope is, rather than keeping us all in decrepitude, there'll be a way to keep us all brightly, and like those centenarians you hear about who are having pint of gin a day and cycling to the shops and then just fall over one day in the prime of their life.
Absolutely. Is it, what do they call it? The blue zones.
Yes, yeah, exactly that kind of thing. Yeah, if we can all have that somehow.
Oh yeah, fingers crossed. That's what I'm striving for. Um, now, I told a couple of people I'd be talking to you and to see if they had anything that they would ask, and they did. So I'm going to ask on their behalf what they would like to ask you. Peter, my friend Peter, said that you're doing your bit to make the nation more science literate. And he wondered how you translate all the difficult science stuff into well-written prose that everyone can understand.
Well, that's a very flattering and kind question. I start from a position of, not really knowing much at all. That's the nature of science. The age when one human could understand all science has long gone. The great privilege of my job is I get to phone the best people in the world and speak to them and they will speak to me, and I have to tell myself, quite firmly, they're not speaking to me. They're speaking to the Times. They don't care remotely about me. But I came to this from general features writing at the Times, and there, if you want to do an interview with Reese Witherspoon or Jed Wood or something, it's this major operation. If I want to do an interview with a Nobel Prize winner, I just send them an email and they get back to me 10 minutes later. And that's the amazing thing about scientists. And so during COVID, I was getting, in a sense, tutorials from the best virologists and epidemiologists in the world. And it was such a privilege. But then you chat to them until you think you understand it. You then get writing. And my rule is I assume my readers are clever, curious, interested people who know absolutely nothing. If I find myself using jargon, then that probably is indicative that I don't understand it myself. And it's really interesting. Sometimes you get reader comments where they sort of accuse you of ignorance because they'll say, "Why haven't you used this word?" And I haven't used that word because then I'd have to explain it, and that would be another line taken. And also, what's the point? I had someone saying that about the word palimpsest recently, which was quite a niche one. He said, "Why didn't you refer to them as palimpsests?" I said, "Well, it's not necessary." But having done that, then you try to find a compelling way to tell the story. Humans are good if there's a human involved. If there's a nice tale of what a human did, that's brilliant. Otherwise, often in science, you need to find some clever metaphors. You need to describe virology, describe how the immune system spots something. I saw one where so if you imagine that it's a bad one, but I found it quite compelling. If you imagine that the virus is ever changing and you've got this, or in fact the pathogen in general, because malaria does something like this, but you find a bit of it that doesn't change. It's a bit like, and that's the thing that you learn to spot. That's the thing you train it to spot. It's a bit like if you've got cars and there's all sorts of different BMWs and they're all different, but if you train it to spot the BMW logo, just that tiny bit of it, then the immune system can go for it. And that's a bit like what happened with the COVID vaccines. You were just looking at the spike protein, just the bit that mattered and the bit that there was more evolutionary pressure perhaps for it to stay the same. So I like analogies, and I like people, and I like getting out there and doing things. One of the things that's really hard to cover in science is climate change, partly because of the abuse, but partly because the story is the same every single year. The story is there's more carbon up there, we're hotter, these things are bad. And it's about finding different ways into it that aren't hectoring readers, because they're quite, like, I don't read those sorts of things because why would I? I know what they're going to say. I don't like it. It's not interesting. A piece I was proud of over the summer was I found a Swiss glaciologist who had done his PhD on a particular glacier, which was quite a low glacier up in the Alps. And I went up with him to see the glacier he'd done his PhD on because it was almost gone. And we went up there to chip off a bit of ice to take home and put in his freezer. So he will always have a little bit of his PhD glacier because it's probably gone now. It's one of those ones that is more human. It's a different way of saying, actually, we're going to lose half the ice in the Alps, and that's already locked in with the current level of warming.
Mm, that makes it a little bit more sobering. You're right. It makes for a compelling story.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Fundamentally, we're branched entertainment industry, and I want people to read us.
Noted. So now the other person who had a question was Ben. This is Ben Vasler, who is actually in charge of everything digital at Chemistry World magazine. He asked me to ask you, what's the science story you wish you'd broken?
Oh God. It's interesting. Actually, it's a really interesting question because often the really big science stories aren't the sort of things that are even covered at the time. Einstein, if I was around in 1905 and Einstein put out special relativity, I mean, you're not turning that into a 600-word story, are you? I mean, it's and so I would have probably left it. I think when the New York Times eventually covered it, they got their golfing correspondent to interview Einstein. It was really strange. So the science stories that are there, and obviously a story at the time, aren't always that clear. Dolly the sheep was one. My colleague at the Observer scooped the world on Dolly the sheep. He spotted the story was happening, and because the Observer's a Sunday newspaper, he couldn't wait for the official date for the story to be released, or he would have lost it. So he just went ahead and they splashed on it, and they got ahead of everyone else. And I thought, good on him. I mean, I would love to be the person who breaks that COVID is definitively natural or COVID is definitively from a lab. That would be the biggest story in the world. But I don't think there's going to be that person, sadly. I don't think we're ever going to get proper closure on that. What other stories? The first predicted solar eclipse, the first one done properly, the transit of Venus. That was a big one for measuring things in astronomically. I think probably it would have been lovely to have done Galileo's trial properly at length with all of the human drama, including the human weaknesses and foibles. I think because that really would have had a human at the center of it, and indeed a human not at the center of it, because it turns out we go around the sun rather than the other way around.
Indeed. Um, well, yes. Okay. Well, look, we'll keep looking out for some great stories for you to break. Um, and then I wonder what proportion of the stories actually come to you versus you having to hunt them down.
It depends. We have our daily churn of stories, which is we get the papers from the major journals ahead of time, and we can see them before the embargo. And that's why, I mean, look, anyone who reads scientific news will notice that everyone seems to have the same stories at the same time every day. So today we are speaking when the UK Atomic Energy Authority announced at 1 p.m. in a press conference that they have broken the record for the most nuclear fusion in the jet facility in Harwell. And everyone covered that because that's major news. The interesting thing is, each day we probably have 100, 150 different stories chucked at us in the similar fashions. The really interesting thing is you will see probably it's the same 3 or 4 stories from those that we all end up picking because it's pretty obvious. But then beyond that, of course, we look for our own stories. So this week I did a story on a guy from Kew who's going around Britain trying to get people's veterinary folklore. What plants do you use for curing, deworming sheep and things like that? Partly just to sort of store the knowledge before it's gone and the history, but partly because it could be pharmaceuticals there. And sometimes, you try to do things a bit bigger. A while ago, I wanted to do a big piece. It's not really science, a big piece on new towns because Labour's planning a whole bunch of new towns. I went to Milton Keynes and I wrote about the history of new towns and all of these things. And sometimes you get to go abroad. I'm really hoping soon that one of the really big undercovered stories at the moment is guinea worm, which is so when President Carter left his presidency, there were 3.5 million people infected with this awful parasite in Africa every year. He decided that he was going to stop it. And last year, unfortunately, President Carter is currently in a hospice, but last year there were 13 infections. He is so close, with plenty of other people, but so close to eradicating a human disease, which is just a glorious achievement. But I want to go out to South Sudan to see them trying to hunt down the very last cases. And it's an amazing story because we write so often about animals becoming extinct. Here is one we're trying our damnedest to make extinct, and hopefully we will.
Oh, I hope so too, before he dies.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Um, Now, right at the beginning, I mentioned that you are a bad loser. Is that true?
It is sort of, well, it depends on your definition of bad losing. I consider myself to be someone who doesn't see the point in playing a game unless you're trying to win it. And that's the sort of thing that kind of annoys people like my children and my wife. A classic example, I guess, would be Scrabble, where I view it as a mathematical problem. Some people view it as a word game and get annoyed when you're not looking for the best words and actually trying to you learn all of the two-letter words and then play them ruthlessly. But that's how I understand the game works. So yes, some people would say I'm a bad loser. I just say I try not to lose, and I'm cross when I do.
I think that's fair enough. I view Scrabble as the only thing I can play on my first generation iPad. And I'm always thrilled when I beat the iPad. Um, so now look, lastly, without ruining any surprises, you're going to be talking the keynote. You're going to be the keynote speaker talking in the Royal Society of Chemistry Theatre at Lab Innovations in October.
Yes, yeah, and I'll look forward to seeing people there. I haven't decided what I'm going to talk about yet, but I will hopefully have some fun anecdotes. My intention is to be fun and hopefully not have people too bored. And I think if one can achieve that, then that's the best possible outcome. So with that proviso, I'd love people to come along and listen to me and hopefully laugh occasionally at my jokes.
Absolutely. And we're very lucky that you can tear yourself away from the Times for long enough to come and be with us there. Tom, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
You too. Thank you very much.